Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my Stellar Crown tier list. Stellar Crown is the brand new set that has just released, and it has definitely shook up the metagame quite a bit. Today, I'm going to be going over exactly where I think the current best and most popular decks in the format are standing. That being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know also what you think of the tier list. Let me know what you agree and also disagree with. I would love to hear from you. But that being said, let's hop right into it. All right, so I'm going to start off with some of the most popular decks, as these are going to be the ones that most people are curious about where I'm putting. And I'm going to start off with Terapagos. Now, Terapagos, the brand new archetype, just got released with Stellar Crown. In my opinion, relatively decent. From the games that I've played with it, I don't think it's exceptional. I don't think it's the best deck in format. I don't even think it's tier 1, but I do think the deck is relatively strong. My preferred way to play this is going to be with something like the Dusknoir. I know some people have tried out the Buffalon to more tanky version, but I think the Dusknoir variant is the strongest way to build it. It does have some issues with Charizard. I don't think the Charizard matchup is actually very good, and that is, I think, a major problem with this deck. I also think Reggie Drago as well, which still should exist, is a relatively tough matchup also for Terapagos. So those are two problems. However, I think you're pretty decent versus a lot of the other big decks. You're relatively consistent as well because you gain things like the Noctowl. You also have Pidgeot EX as well. So you're a very consistent deck that has a lot of control over games. However, its power level is definitely something that is one of the weaknesses. So at the moment, I'm going to put Terapagos in tier 1.5. I don't think it's tier 1. I think it's decent, but at the moment, we're going to put it there. Next up, we're going to go over, let's do Palkia. So there's two variants of Palkia that have been seen play. There's the Palkia Dusknoir variant, and then there's also the Palkia Area 01. I kind of think they're both in the same tier as of right now. Palkia with Area 0, I think definitely can struggle to Zard. And also the Reggie Drago matchup feels kind of like a coin flip, but it's still fundamentally relatively strong. And for my testing, it's been okay. I don't think it's a tier 1 deck, kind of like the Terapagos deck, but it still feels solid. Definitely a deck that I don't think is overpowered in any way. I kind of like the Dusknoir variant a little bit more, just because you're better in Zard for my testing. So yeah, we're going to put Palkia, just like the archetype in general, in tier 1.5. I definitely don't think it's amazing, but I think it's definitely very formidable. Next up here, let's go over Galvantula. So there's a couple ways to play the Galvantula deck. You can play it with Regigigas, or you can play it with something like the Blissey. The deck just doesn't set up as much as I would like. In theory, if it gets going, it can be relatively strong, but it can run out of steam, doesn't set up as much as you would like in most circumstances, and it just feels relatively average. So we're going to put it in tier 1 or tier 2.5 at the moment. It's okay. It's not great. Definitely a little bit disappointed. It did definitely get a lot of hype, but I think that it's kind of fallen on hard times, I think, over the past week or so. Once people kind of started to test the deck out, they're like, okay, this deck is actually not as good as a lot of people kind of initially thought, because being able to item lock and being able to loop item lock, theory is pretty good. However, it's definitely not a stable loop, and also it sometimes is quite difficult to even get to that point. So yeah, put it there. Next up, we got, let's do Gardevoir. Gardevoir is very good. I think it's a tier 1 deck at the moment, with Reggie Drago losing popularity. I still think this deck is exceptionally strong. Definitely a very, very powerful deck in the format. Doesn't really lose anything. Doesn't really gain anything, but it's still pretty good. Obviously, just won the Baltimore Regional Championships. It's a different format, but in this format, Reggie Drago is expected to go down in percentage play rate, so that just kind of helps out the deck. I think it has a pretty decent Terapagos matchup, has a pretty decent Palkia matchup as well. So I think this deck is definitely very, very solid right now. Next up, we have Raging Bolt. I think Raging Bolt is a tier 1 deck. I think it's very good. Gaining things like Crispin and Briar is very good for the deck. So I definitely think that Raging Bolt deserves its spot up in tier 1. It kind of had a rough end to the previous formats. It did not necessarily see a whole lot of success at Baltimore for the amount of people that played it. However, I think in this format, it definitely gets a little bit better. I think you're probably the best turbo deck overall. I think Roaring Moon is very close with it, but I think that Raging Bolt is going to be a tier 1 deck. Probably at the bottom of tier 1, definitely not at the top, but I still think it deserves its spot over things like the Terapagoses of the world and Palkia. I think it's fundamentally a better deck. Next up here, we have, let's do Ancient Box. I think Ancient Box is a tier 2 deck. The big issue is Briar right now. A lot of these Terra decks are playing Briar, which makes your prize trade as a 1 prize deck significantly less favorable. So one of the biggest advantages that the Ancient Box deck has had is favorable prize trades. However, with things like Raging Bolt playing Briar, Terapagos playing Briar, a lot of these 2 prize decks are now kind of able to fix that prize trade at some point. So I think that Ancient Box is definitely going to lower itself. If Gardevoir sees more play, if decks like Zard also see more play, which Zard is expected to go up in like play rate as well, then I definitely think that Ancient Box can struggle for sure. So that's why I currently have it in tier 2. It's still a fundamentally decent deck. However, I just don't think the metagame is right for it at the moment. It's still pretty good though. Next up, we have Zard. I think Zard overall is probably the strongest deck in the format, just fundamentally. It has the ability to tech for most matchups. You're pretty decent into everything. You have lines. You're relatively consistent once you get going. You get the Pidgeot up. It's just such a powerful deck. It's just so powerful. You do take really rough matchups against things with like the Ogerpon, things like Stall and Control. Those two decks that like play the Ogerpon can definitely cause a lot of issues when you have to deal with the fighting one. So yeah, that's kind of the big problem with the deck. But other than that, those decks aren't necessarily super popular. So not something to worry about too much. You can get sometimes overwhelmed by hyper aggressive Dusknoirs. If you're playing against a deck that wins the coin flip and goes like double Dusknoir turn 2, then it can be kind of scary. Or if they just go and use like a Dusknoir and then they knock out your other Charmander, you can kind of get board wiped in those situations. But and your Dragapult matchup is also kind of scary. But overall, it just feels like fundamentally the best deck. Has decent matchups against everything. You pretty much sit down, and as long as it's not Control or Stall, you feel like you have a good shot against them. And even if you want to, beat things, like Snorlax Stall, you can maybe add in maybe a Thornton or, some card, like maybe even like a Gouging Fire as well. Like that helps to, fix the Quad Ogerpon matchup. So that's another thing as well that you could potentially play. But overall, it's a tier 1 deck. I think it's probably the strongest deck overall and has the ability to beat everything for the most part. Next up, we have Roaring Moon. I think Roaring Moon's still very good. I prefer the Darkrai Dusknoir variant, somewhat similar to the list that Alex Szymanski played to get top 128 at the Baltimore Regional Championships. I believe Tim Franklin popularized it at Worlds, playing a list that was similar to Alex's, I believe. So I think this deck is decent. I think that Dusknoir really helps out against Charizard. If you don't play Dusknoir, your matchup versus Charizard is just so rough. So I think you got to play Dusknoir to even give yourself a chance. I think it's a good deck. I definitely think it's very solid. Next up, we're going to just put some of the rogue decks. I tested Regigigas, didn't feel great. Lost on Radzard tier 2.5, Slow King. What else? Hydrapple, Greninja, Turbo Gouging Fire. Definitely rogue decks. Not saying any of these decks are just all terrible. They're just kind of rogue decks right now. United Wings as well. Future Box, definitely a rogue deck. Iron Valiant, Great Tusk. We're just going to kind of get through all of these at the moment that I think are rogue decks. Meowscarada as well. That pretty much does it for the rogue decks, I think. So anyways, moving on, we have Lugia. Lugia is still very good in my opinion. I think its Zard matchup gets a lot closer because of Briar. Definitely tightens that matchup quite a bit, but I think you're decent against Palkia and Terapagos. You've typically been pretty good against the Turbo decks as well. Your Gardevoir matchup is definitely pretty scary, especially if they play a tech card like an Enhanced Hammer or Temple of Sinnoh. You can definitely run into problems, but I think fundamentally it's still a very powerful deck. Next up, we have Dragapults. I think Dragapults tier 1.5. I do think it's just worse Charizard in a lot of ways. I think Charizard is just a better Pidgeot variant. So for my testing, it's felt a little bit underwhelming, but still very powerful. I think it's slightly worse than what people I think originally were thinking once it gained the new Crystal A-Spec card, but it's still solid in my opinion. But honestly, I'd probably put it over Terapagos and Palkia. I guess I'd honestly also put Lugia over in my opinion right now too. I think that this is probably exactly where I would rank it at the moment. It's still very solid, but has some problems, versus a lot of the Turbo decks. Dragapult can kind of just get ran over. Your Gardevoir matchup is actually also not very good because if they play Double Monkey Dory and Professor Turo, they can just kind of out heal a lot of the spread damage you're trying to put on the board, and they can get into like a 2-shot war with things like Turo, and it doesn't end up very well a lot of the time. So overall, I still think it's a very good deck though. I think it's good. I just don't think it's broken like some people are saying it is. Next up, we got Reggie Drago. I think Reggie Drago is overall the second best deck in the format. People are forgetting about the deck. This typically happens at the beginning of formats where people, stop playing the decks that don't necessarily gain a whole lot. For example, Reggie Drago doesn't gain anything, and people kind of gravitate towards the decks that play the new things. So we see in like online tournaments, a lot of these, decks that don't really gain anything, their play rate really starts to dip for the first couple weeks, and then they start to do really well again, and people realize, why were we playing this deck to begin with? Same thing kind of, I think is going to apply to Reggie Drago, where the deck doesn't lose anything, doesn't really gain anything. It's just still fundamentally very good. So that's the reason why I think Reggie Drago is going to stay at the top. It's incredibly powerful, has good shots against everything in the format. It's a pretty skill-intensive deck as well. There's a lot of resource managing and stuff like that that you have to do with the deck. And it has a decent Zard matchup, decent Gardevoir matchup. Your Bolt matchup is definitely really scary, but a lot of these other decks, like I think Terapagos and Palkia, they feel like pretty good matchups. So overall, I think Reggie Drago is amazing, still a tier 1 deck, and definitely a threat to see success in future tournaments. Next up here, we have Snorlax. I think Snorlax is tier 2. The deck is quite decent right now. However, your matchups against things like Lugia and Roaring Moon are just abysmal. Your Palkia Dusknoir matchup is pretty scary as well. And you're also prone to the deck just like getting teched out of the format. For example, there are a couple regionals coming up soon, and if Snorlax sees success, then there's a chance that the next like tournament right after it, then the deck kind of becomes unplayable because everyone takes that out of the format. So I think it's a very, very solid deck. Definitely has decent matchups against a lot of things. Honestly, I think I'll put it in tier 1.5 the more I think about it. I think we'll put Snorlax right here. I think it's still pretty good. Honestly, we'll put it right here. I think Snorlax is still pretty good. Very, very solid deck. Has a good Zard matchup. Reggie Drago matchup's favored if they don't play Cologne. If they play Cologne, it's a little bit scarier. Gardevoir matchup is largely dependent on whether or not they play something like Spiritomb or second Professor Turo. If they play either of those cards, it becomes a lot closer. Raging Bolt matchup is decent. Your Polt matchup is pretty good as well. It's definitely losable, but pretty good. But you just have some really bad matchups against some of these decks. Like your Lugia matchup is not great. Your Roaring Moon matchup is abysmal. Your Terapagos matchup can actually get a little bit scary as well if they play the heavy like Dusknoir. They can kind of loop that and just kind of do some shenanigans. It can become kind of scary, and your Palkia Dusknoir matchup can also be pretty spooky. But overall, it's still fundamentally a very good deck. Definitely, Stall is a deck to be respected for sure moving forward. If you want to beat it, but you know, sometimes you just don't want to beat it. But like I should mention that as well. Anyways, Bayonet tier 2.5 still seems like a decent deck at the moment. Bayonet Gardevoir or Bayonet Dusknoir, both of them definitely pretty decent. Item locking like definitely catch people off guards. It did see some success at Baltimore, but definitely think it's a pretty solid deck. Chen Pao tier 2.5. Dialga will go into Rogue. The issue is Briar and also like Dusknoir and Dusclops create problems for this deck just because they're able to knock out a Charizard, or a Charizard is able to knock out a like Dialga much quicker than it used to be able to, so you don't have as much time as you'd like. So unfortunately it goes in Rogue. Goldango tier 2.5 did okay at Worlds, a deck that sometimes shows up. Iron Thorns tier 2.5 as well. I just think there's too many decks that counter it now. For example, Gardevoir is a really bad matchup. Reggie Drago is not a great matchup as well. A lot of Raging Bolts are playing Flutter Mane, so it's just with Lugia, also kind of like declining in play as well. It doesn't feel like a deck that has a ton of super great matchups. So that's why I have it there. Lost Box. Lost Box is tier 2.5. I think Turbo Lost Box. If Reggie Drago goes down and people aren't playing Jirachi or Manaphy, Lost Box does get a lot better. However, we haven't seen success really from it in quite some time, so we're going to kind of have to see it moving forward before I kind of want to move it up. So at the moment, I think Lost Box is a tier 2.5 deck. Next up, we got Miraidon, Turbo Miraidon. It gains Area 0, which is kind of nice. It means you can use Raikou a little bit more. You can play the Mewtwo EX to provide that Terra because it is a Terra type. I think it's decent. I think it's the weakest out of the 3 Turbo decks. I think Raging Bolt and Roaring Moon are a little bit better, but I think that Miraidon is definitely a respected deck. Next up, we got Lasso and Giratina, tier 2.5. Decent deck, has been seeing some play recently, but I just think that a lot of decks just kind of outdo it. I think a lot of decks are just fundamentally better, I think, at the moment. So, like Lostina, it's okay, but I definitely would put a lot of other decks over it. And last but not least, we have Pidgeot Control. I think Pidgeot Control is still a very it should be a well-respected deck, and it's also, I think, decently positioned right now. Your Charizard matchup is decent. You have a decent stall matchup as well. Your favorite in the stall, because you have things like Luxray, so you're just naturally kind of able to blow up their hand, which is pretty good. So I think you're pretty good against that matchup. Your Gardevoir matchup is close, but I think potentially slightly favored. It really depends on how many Turo they play. Your Reggie Drago matchup is like fine. Your Zard matchup with like the Ogre Pawn, you can kind of just like run them over a lot of the time by just like stalling them out, and the game just isn't even close. If they don't have any text for it, they just can't deal with it. So overall, I think that Pidgeot Control is still definitely quite solid. It's just can be a hard deck to play. You can tie games as well with it, so you do kind of run into some issues. So in best of 3, it's definitely something you have to be careful with, along with stall as well. But anyways, that's gonna do it for my tier list. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. If you enjoy this content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Also, shout out to Burr as well for making this like tier list. So anyways, this is my current tier list. Shout out to them for like making the template. And with that being said, I will also leave the tier list in the description as well, like if you want to make your own. But anyways, thanks so much for all the support as always. This is Smart TCG. I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out.